The map, brittle with age and authority, lay across the small kitchen table like a judgment. Mr. Davies, the county tax assessor, smoothed its curling edge with a proprietary thumb. His fingernail was clean, a thing Agnes noticed because her own were permanently underlined with the dark soil of her garden. He tapped a square of land outlined in faded red ink. "This parcel, Mrs. Thorne. Number 73. Yours, I believe." Agnes said nothing, her hands resting in the lap of her flour-dusted apron. The air smelled of yeast and the faint, sweet scent of beeswax from the polish she used on the table. "The taxes are 3 years in arrears," he continued, his voice a smooth blend of pity and procedural coldness. He was a man who enjoyed the small ceremonies of ruin. "The drought has been hard on everyone. The county is sympathetic, of course, but the law is the law. We'll have to put it up for auction at the end of the month." He looked around the small, scoured clean cottage, at the worn but mended curtains and the single pot of geraniums on the windowsill. It was the look of a man appraising firewood. He saw a widow, alone, clinging to a worthless patch of sour-grass bottomland. He saw an easy foreclosure. A woman alone, he sighed, performing compassion. It's a hard thing to make a go of it. Agnes finally looked up from the map, her eyes a placid gray. "That is my parcel, yes. Number 73. Her voice was quiet, as steady as the slow rise of her bread. Mr. Davies smiled, a small, tight motion of his lips. The matter was settled. He began to roll the map. "Wait," Agnes said. He paused, his hand still. She leaned forward, her worn finger tracing a line from her small square to the one adjacent. "Parcel 74, Mr. Miller's old pasture, and 75, where the creek bends. Who holds the deed to those?" A flicker of annoyance crossed Davies's face. "Foreclosed last autumn. The county holds them." "What? In the stretch north of the road? Number 68? The one the bank took from the Henderson boys after their father passed. Also county land." He was impatient now. This was irrelevant theater. "I see." Agnes's finger continued its slow journey across the paper, a pilgrimage over rivers of ink and boundaries of failure. It tapped one parcel, then another, a soft, deliberate rhythm against the brittle paper. 7, 8, 9, 10. Finally, her finger came to rest on his own handsome tract of land, parcel 92, the one he'd bought for a song 2 years ago. "And this one?" Mr. Davies's condescension curdled into suspicion. "That is my property. What is the meaning of this?" Agnes met his gaze. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a quiet statement of fact, as plain and solid as the fieldstones in her foundation. "The meaning, Mr. Davies, is that the county does not hold those deeds." "I do. I bought them. The 10 you just named. And this 1 inch," she tapped the map one last time, on the small red square of her own cottage. "And I will be paying the taxes on all 11 of them this afternoon. In cash." The silence that fell in the small kitchen was heavier than a winter snow. Outside, the dust of the drought-stricken road swirled in the wind, but inside, the world had gone still. Mr. Davies stared at the woman he thought sold a bit of butter money at the church, and for the first time, he saw a stranger. 23 years earlier, no one in Prosperity Flats had seen a stranger. They had seen precisely what they expected to see, a problem. Agnes Thorne arrived on a wagon that looked one rut away from total collapse, with a single sway-back Jersey cow tethered to the rear. She was a widow before she was 30, a thin, quiet woman in a faded black dress that had seen too much sun. The town watched from behind curtains and from the shaded porch of the general store as she led her sorry-looking animal to the small, forgotten parcel of land she'd bought with the last of her husband's savings. It wasn't a farm. It was a mistake. 5 acres of low-lying ground by the dwindling creek, land the locals called the Sour Patch for the tough, bitter grasses that grew there. No decent farmer would touch it. It was too wet in the spring and too weedy in the summer, and the soil was said to be thin and unkind. "Might as well set up housekeeping in the creek itself," muttered Mr. Miller, whose own vast, rolling pastures bordered her property. He was a man whose wealth was measured in herds and acreage, and he looked upon Agnes's small enterprise with the disdain of a king for a mud puddle. Mr. Davies, then just a clerk at the bank, but already practicing his future role, had been the one to sign her papers. He'd warned her, "This isn't land for for a person on their own. It'll break your back for nothing." Agnes had simply nodded, her signature on the deed a spare, unadorned thing. The town gave her a season, maybe two. They saw her digging a garden by hand, turning over the dense, clay-heavy soil with a spade that seemed too large for her. They saw her patching the leaky roof of the derelict cottage with tar she'd heated herself over an open fire. They saw her leading her cow, which she called Clover, to the patches of scrubby grass and strange, tough-stemmed wildflowers that no other cattle would eat. The women of the church auxiliary, led by Miller's wife, made a charity call, bringing a basket of dry biscuits and watery jam. They offered pity disguised as concern. "You must be so lonely out here, dear," Mrs. Miller said, her eyes sweeping over the bare-scrubbed floors and the stark, clean poverty of the cottage. "It's quiet," Agnes had replied, which was not the same thing at all. The men just laughed. "That Sour Patch cow of hers will give milk thin as ditch water," Miller told the men at the store, and they all chuckled. They were men of substance. They understood the arithmetic of the land. Good grass meant fat cattle. Fat cattle meant rich milk. Rich milk meant wealth. Agnes Thorne, with her one bony cow and her 5 acres of weeds, was a zero in their calculations. A ghost on the landscape. She did not argue. She did not explain. She met their mockery with a stillness that they mistook for defeat. Day after day, she rose before the sun had bleached the deep purple from the sky. Day after day, she worked. What they did not see, what they could not comprehend, was that Agnes was not farming the way they were. She was listening. She was watching. And in the quiet economy of the Sour Patch, she was beginning to find a value no one else had ever thought to look for. She began her days not with the sun, but with the stars still sharp in the sky. The first ritual was the fire, coaxing a flame from the embers banked in the stove. Then came the walk to the small lean-to that served as a barn. In the pre-dawn chill, the air would be thick with the sweet, grassy scent of the cow and the sharper smell of hay. Clover, against all of Miller's predictions, was not thriving, but she was holding her own. Agnes would rest her forehead against the cow's warm flank as she milked, the rhythmic hiss and sigh into the pail a form of prayer. The milk was not thin. It was, to her surprise, shockingly rich, with a heavy cap of cream that was the color of pale gold. She soon learned why. She walked her land not as an owner, but as a student. The men saw weeds. Agnes saw tapestry. She found that the tough, wiry grasses the other cattle scorned were deep-rooted, pulling nutrients from far below the thin topsoil. And woven among them were plants the ranchers cursed and tore out. Wild garlic, sweet clover, a dozen varieties of herbs she didn't know the names of, but whose leaves, when crushed, released pungent, complex aromas. Her cow, left to its own devices, ate them all. It was this strange diet, she reasoned, that gave the milk its unique character. It wasn't the bland, uniform product of a manicured pasture. It was the essence of the Sour Patch itself, distilled into cream. She found her teacher in the town's other outsider, Mrs. Petrov, an old woman from a country whose name most people in Prosperity Flats couldn't pronounce. She lived on the edge of town and was regarded with a mixture of suspicion and awe. They said she knew things about the land, about healing. Agnes, seeking knowledge, brought her a small pat of butter as a gift. Mrs. Petrov, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, unwrapped the muslin cloth, sniffed the butter, and then broke off a piece. She closed her eyes as it melted on her tongue. When she opened them, they were sharp and clear. "This is not from pasture cow," she said, her accent thick as honey. "This is from land with story. Many plants, strong plants," Agnes explained about her Sour Patch. The old woman nodded slowly, a deep understanding in her eyes. "They call it sour because they are fools," she said, her voice raspy. "They want land that shouts. Big grass, big cow. Easy, but the best things they whisper. You must bend down to hear them." She took Agnes's hand, her own dry and cool as roots. "The land gives back what you put in, child, not what you shout at it. You put in patience. You listen. It gives you gold. Mrs. Petrov taught her the names of the plants. She showed her which ones deepened the flavor of the milk and which ones helped keep the cow healthy through the winter. She taught Agnes the slow, patient art of observation, a language the loud, confident men of the town had never learned. The work was methodical, a rhythm set by the seasons and the needs of a single animal. After milking, Agnes would carry the heavy pails to the cool, stone-lined cellar of her cottage. There, in the quiet dark, she skimmed the thick cream into a large earthenware crock. Every few days, when the cream was perfectly ripened, came the churning. It was a task of muscle and patience. The steady plunge and lift of the dasher, the sloshing sound that slowly thickened, the change in resistance that signaled the moment of transformation. And then, the magic, the breaking of the cream into golden grains of butter swimming in pale, thin buttermilk. She would gather the grains, wash them meticulously in cold, clean water from her well, squeezing out every last drop of buttermilk that could make it spoil. She worked the butter with wooden paddles on a marble slab her husband had once used for his leatherwork, the stone drawing the last of the warmth from it. Finally, the salt, a precise measure, worked in until it was perfectly distributed. The final product was unlike any other butter in the county. It was a deep, glorious yellow, the color of dandelions in spring, and it tasted not just of salt and cream, but of the sun and the wild, complicated earth of her scorned land. It was rich, complex, with a faint, lingering herbal note that was impossible to place, but utterly delicious. She began to sell it quietly at the back of the church during the weekly bake sale. She'd bring a basket with a dozen 1-pound bricks, each wrapped in clean, damp muslin and stamped with the simple image of a clover leaf. The townswomen bought it. "It's a lovely color, dear," they'd say, patting her hand. They treated it as a charity, a way to help the poor widow make a few pennies. They used it on their daily bread, never thinking much of it, taking its quiet excellence for granted. The men, of course, paid it no mind. It was butter, woman's work, a trivial thing in a world of cattle auctions and grain prices. They did not see the slow, steady accumulation of coins in the jar Agnes kept hidden under a loose floorboard. They did not notice that after a year, Clover had a healthy calf. And after another, Agnes had saved enough to buy the adjoining 5-acre parcel of Sour Patch, also considered worthless for a pittance. The arithmetic began. Each night, by the light of a single candle, Agnes would sit with her ledger. On one side, the cost of salt, of muslin, of a new handle for the churn. On the other, the growing column of pennies and dimes from the church sales. It was the arithmetic of survival, slow and painstaking, but it was adding up. She kept her success secret, banking it like a coal kept low under ash, knowing that a small flame, unattended, is easily snuffed out by the winds of scorn and envy. She let them think she was just getting by. She let them believe she was just the butter woman, a fixture of quiet pity at the edge of their prosperous world. The turning point did not come from within Prosperity Flats. It arrived on the wheels of a dusty carriage, in the form of a man named Alistair Henderson. He was a baker from the capital city, a man whose reputation was built on sourcing the finest ingredients. His carriage had thrown a wheel just outside of town, and while it was being repaired, he found himself at the church, hungry, just as the weekly sale was ending. He bought a biscuit from Mrs. Miller's table. It was dry and bland. Agnes, packing up her nearly empty basket, saw the disappointment on his face. On impulse, she offered him the last biscuit from her own lunch, a simple thing she'd baked that morning. "Put a bit of this on it," she said, handing him a small crock containing the unsold end of her butter. Henderson, a man of polite habits, did as he was told. He spread the golden butter on the humble biscuit, took a bite, and stopped. His eyes, which had been glazed with the boredom of a weary traveler, sharpened with an almost electric focus. He took another bite, slower this time, chewing thoughtfully, his entire being concentrated on the flavors unfolding on his palate. He looked from a biscuit to Agnes, a genuine astonishment on his face. "My good woman," he said, his city accent clipping the words. "What is this?" "It's just butter, sir." "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, This is not just butter. I have tasted butter from the finest dairies in the East. I have imported butter from France. I have never tasted anything quite like this. It has a soul." He peppered her with questions. What did she feed her cow? Where was her pasture? How did she churn? Agnes answered plainly, without embellishment. He listened, fascinated, to the story of the Sour Patch and its wild herbs. He understood immediately what the local farmers, in their blunt pursuit of volume, had missed entirely. He saw the value in the whisper. Before his carriage was repaired, he made her a proposition. He would buy every pound of butter she could produce. He would pay her 3 times what she was getting at the church sale. But it had to be their secret. He had competitors, he explained, and an ingredient of this quality was a weapon in the quiet wars of his trade. He wanted it all for himself. "I will send a driver every 2 weeks," he said, pressing a handful of silver dollars in her hand as a down payment. "Have as much as you can ready for him. Pack it in ice from your ice house." Agnes, who did not have an ice house, simply nodded. That week, she used the baker's money to hire a young orphan boy named Thomas to help her dig one. Thomas was 15, a boy on the verge of manhood with nowhere to go. He was thin and perpetually hungry, and he'd been sleeping in the livery stable, doing odd jobs for scraps. The town saw him as a stray, another piece of driftwood. Agnes saw the steady, honest look in his eyes. He arrived at her farm, wary and suspicious, but her quiet, no-nonsense kindness disarmed him. She didn't preach at him or pity him. She fed him a hot meal and then handed him a shovel. "The hole needs to be 8 feet deep," she said, pointing to a spot under the shade of a large oak tree. "The work is hard, but the pay is fair." They worked side by side, digging the ice house deep into the cool, dense clay. In the evenings, she taught him to read and write by candlelight, using the Bible and an old almanac as their texts. For the first time in his life, Thomas felt the solid ground of purpose beneath his feet. He began to help with the farm, his lanky strength a welcome addition. He learned the rhythm of the churn, the feel of the butter when it was ready, the names of the plants in the Sour Patch. He learned the quiet dignity of labor and the deep satisfaction of creating something of value from a place no one wanted. The arithmetic changed. With Henderson's regular payments, the column of income in Agnes's ledger grew dramatically. It was no longer the math of survival. It was the math of ambition. She bought another Jersey cow, then another. She and Thomas cleared more of the Sour Patch, not by tearing out the wild herbs, but by carefully managing them. They bought the 10-acre plot on the other side of the creek, land that had been on the county rolls for years, untouched. No one noticed. To the people of Prosperity Flats, it was just Agnes Thorne, the poor butter widow, acquiring more worthless land. They saw her and the orphan boy as 2 stray souls clinging to the margins, and they shook their heads with a kind of sad satisfaction. Her quiet expansion was invisible to them because they had already decided what she was. Each time the baker's wagon arrived, under the cover of dusk, Thomas would help load the heavy, ice-packed crates. The driver, a taciturn man, would hand over a small, heavy pouch of coins and be on his way. Agnes would take the pouch to her ledger. She would count out what she needed for supplies, a fair wage for Thomas, and a small amount for her own modest needs. The rest, the vast majority, went into the jar under the floorboard. When the jar was full, she would make a quiet trip to the bank in the next county, not the one in Prosperity Flats where Mr. Davies now sat in an important chair. She never bought on credit. She always paid in cash. Parcel by parcel, acre by acre, her holdings grew. The Sour Patch became a quiet kingdom of 30, then 40, then 50 acres. She owned the land all the way down to the old stone bridge, but her fence lines never changed. To the outside world, she was still the woman with a 5-acre mistake. She lived the same simple life, her hands still rough, her dresses still plain. The only difference was the quiet confidence in her eyes and the way Thomas, now a tall, capable young man, looked at her with a fierce, filial devotion. They were a family, built not on blood, but on shared work and mutual respect, a fortress of 2 on their island of scorned land. For 10 years, the arrangement held, and then the sky turned to brass. It began in the spring. The rains that should have come were little more than a miserly sprinkle, barely enough to settle the dust. By June, the sun was a relentless, punishing force. The creek shrank, the wells grew shallow. Miller's vast, rolling pastures of tender, shallow-rooted grass were the first to suffer. They turned from green to yellow, then to a brittle, lifeless brown. The earth cracked open in patterns like broken pottery. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The town's shared well went dry. Then the private ones began to fail. Miller's great herd of cattle grew thin, their ribs showing like the hoops on a barrel. Their milk became watery and scarce. The other ranchers faced the same fate. The entire economy of Prosperity Flats, built on the easy abundance of grass and water, began to crumble. At first, Agnes's land seemed to suffer with the rest. The creek that ran through it shrank to a muddy trickle. But the Sour Patch had a secret resilience. The deep-rooted, tough-stem plants that the other farmers had scorned were now its salvation. Their roots reached down to the deep moisture that the shallow pasture grasses could not find. While Miller's fields were a brown wasteland, Agnes's land remained stubbornly, miraculously, tinged with green. Her small herd of Jersey cows, bred for hardiness, continued to find forage. They grew leaner, but they remained healthy, and they continued to produce their rich, fragrant milk. The difference was stark and undeniable. The butter from the big farms, what little there was of it, became a pale, greasy substance with a flat, dispirited taste. Agnes's butter, however, retained its deep yellow color and its complex, herbal flavor. It was a taste of a world that was vanishing, a memory of greenness and life in a season of dust and death. The mockery that had followed Agnes for 2 decades fell silent. It was replaced by a grudging, fearful respect. The town's prosperity had been a shallow-rooted thing, just like their grass. It had flourished in the easy years, but the first real hardship had withered it. Agnes's wealth, built slowly, patiently, on a foundation of what everyone else had despised, was deep-rooted. It was proving to be the only thing that could withstand the drought. The town's supply chain of flavor and fat, which they had always taken for granted, broke down completely. The general store ran out of lard. The butcher had little to sell. Meals became grim, monotonous affairs of boiled beans and dry bread. Hunger changes a town. It strips away the easy postures of pride and condescension. It replaces mockery with the raw, humbling calculus of need. The first to come was not a man, but a woman. Mrs. Miller appeared at Agnes's gate one evening, not in her fine church dress, but in a plain, faded frock. She did not look at Agnes's face, but at the ground. In her hand, she carried an empty crock. "Mrs. Thorne," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "My children, they won't eat the bread plain." It was a confession of profound defeat. Her husband, the great Mr. Miller, the man who had laughed the loudest at Agnes's Sour Patch cow, was ruined. His herd was half dead, his credit at the bank on. They were facing a winter with nothing. Agnes looked at the woman who had once offered her pity and saw not an enemy, but a neighbor in pain. She could have turned her away. She could have named a price that would have stripped the Miller family of their last few coins. She could have savored the reversal of their fortunes, the sweet, righteous taste of vindication. She did none of those things. She simply took the crock from Mrs. Miller's trembling hand, went into her cool, dark cellar, and filled it to the brim with fresh, sweet butter. When she returned, she handed it back. "There is no charge," Agnes said quietly. Mrs. Miller looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "But why?" "Because hunger is a hard winter," Agnes replied, "and no one should face it alone." After Mrs. Miller, others came. The blacksmith's wife, the store owner, the wives of the farmhands who had been let go. They came with shame in their eyes and empty containers in their hands. They came to the woman they had scorned, now the sole proprietor of the richness their families craved. Agnes established a system. For those who had money, she set a price. It was a fair price, the same she had charged at the church for years, not a penny more. For those who had nothing, she bartered. A pound of butter for a mended pair of boots. 2 pounds for a day's work from a husband or a son, clearing stones from a new field. She accepted jars of preserved peaches, knitted socks, a promise to help with the harvest if the rains ever returned. She was not running a business. She was weaving a community back together, thread by thread. Thomas, now a man of 25 with his own quiet authority, managed the transactions at the gate, his presence a calm buffer that spared the townspeople the full depth of their embarrassment. He understood what Agnes was doing. It wasn't about profit, it was about worth. She was teaching the town a new kind of arithmetic, one where generosity was an asset and community was the only true currency. The men who had once laughed at her now averted their eyes when she passed. Their laughter had been rooted in the easy soil of their own success. Now that the soil had turned to dust, they had nothing left to say. They saw her small herd of healthy cows, her stubbornly green fields, and the line of their own wives at her gate, and they were forced to confront the depth of their misjudgment. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. So they whispered. They said she was a witch, that she had cast a spell on her land. They said she had a secret well, or that she was hoarding water. The envy was a sour, curdled thing, far more bitter than her land had ever been. It was this envy that reached the ears of Mr. Davies, the tax assessor. He saw the drought not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. Land was cheap. Farmers were desperate. A man with cash and a cold heart could build an empire on their ruin. He had been buying up foreclosed properties all over the county, consolidating his power. He had watched Agnes's small, quiet success with a growing sense of irritation. In his world, a lone woman was not supposed to succeed. Her resilience was an affront to the natural order of things. When he heard the whispers, he smiled. He knew the drought had been hard on everyone. He assumed Agnes, despite her butter, was just as stretched as the rest. He imagined her, isolated and vulnerable, her small savings depleted by her own generosity. The law, he knew, was a perfect instrument for the greedy. He pulled the county tax rolls and saw what he expected. 3 years of unpaid taxes on Parcel 73. It was the lever he needed. He saw his path clearly. He would foreclose on her original plot, the heart of her operation. He would take the land, the cows, the secret of the Sour Patch, and he would own the only source of wealth left in Prosperity Flats. He would be the king of the Dust Bowl. It was with this grand vision in his mind that he had ridden out to her farm, the rolled-up map under his arm, a speech of false sympathy prepared on his lips. He was not just collecting a debt. He was correcting what he saw as an error in the world. He was putting a woman back in her place. And so he stood in her clean, quiet kitchen, the scent of baking bread in the air, the world rearranging itself around him. The map on the table was no longer a tool of his power. It was a testament to his blindness. Each parcel she had named was a nail in the coffin of his arrogance. Number 74, Miller's Pride. Number 68, the Henderson boys' inheritance. Parcel after parcel, the lands of the men who had mocked her, who had failed, who had been forced to sell for pennies on the dollar to a faceless bank in the next county. A bank that had then sold the deeds to a quiet, steady customer who always paid in cash. A customer named Agnes Thorne. All 11, she repeated, her voice calm and even. I believe the total comes to $87. Thomas has the money ready. The sound of his own breathing filled his ears. He looked at her hands, resting on the table. They were not the hands of a victim. They were the hands of a founder, strong and capable, hands that had built a life out of nothing, churned wealth from weeds, and quietly, patiently, bought the world out from under his feet. The final humiliation came a moment later. The kitchen door opened and Thomas stepped in, no longer a boy but a man, tall and broad-shouldered. Behind him stood Mr. Miller, his face grim, and the blacksmith, and 2 other farmers whose land Agnes now owned. They weren't there as a threat. They were there as witnesses. They were the men who now worked for her, bartering their labor for the food that kept their families alive. They were part of her new arithmetic. Davies looked at their faces, stripped of their old pride, and saw the truth. Agnes Thorne hadn't just survived. She had prevailed, and she had done it not by being ruthless, but by being right. He rolled up the map, his hands shaking slightly. He could not meet her eyes. "The county will expect you this afternoon," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He fled her kitchen, the scent of her baking bread following him like a judgment out into the dusty, barren world he had helped to create. He had come to foreclose on a widow. He had left in the debt of a queen. That evening, the sky, which had been a sheet of blank, merciless blue for months, began to bruise with clouds. A cool wind, smelling of rain, stirred the dust in the yard. Agnes stood on her porch with Thomas and Mrs. Petrov, who had come to share in the quiet victory. The first drops of rain fell, dark and fat, making small craters in the dust. The smell of the thirsty earth drinking was the smell of absolution. Mrs. Petrov placed a hand on Agnes's arm. "The land gives back what you put in," the old woman said, her voice full of a deep, resonant peace. "You put in patience. You listen. It gives you gold." Agnes looked out over the sour patch, her unlikely kingdom, as the rain began to fall in earnest. She thought of the years of solitary work, the quiet mornings, the weight of the churn, the mockery of her neighbors. She had never shouted. She had never argued. She had simply bent down, listened to the whisper of the land, and worked. The wealth she had accumulated was not in the coins or the deeds, but in the resilience she had cultivated in the soil and in herself. The 11 parcels were not a weapon, but a shield, protecting not just her, but the very community that had once sought to cast her out. The rain washed the dust from the air, and across the fields, the stubborn, deep-rooted plants of the sour patch lifted their leaves to the sky, ready to grow again.